Some people wake up with anxiety in the morning, that nervousness prodding them awake like a hungry cat, followed by unshakable worry that spins them more and more awake, no coffee needed, and builds throughout the day because they can't figure out why they're anxious. This is the case for my patients with generalized anxiety disorder, GAD, who wake up anxious, worry their way through the day, and then continue their binge worrying late into the night, fueled by thoughts of why can't I get to sleep? Other folks have panic attacks that come out of the blue, or, as happens with me, that wake them from sleep in the middle of the night. Still others worry about specific things or themes, yet oddly are unaffected by other events or categories that one would think should drive them bonkers. And of course, it would be very unpsychiatrist-like of me not to mention that there is quite a lengthy list of anxiety disorders. Despite my medical training, I'm a bit hesitant to label things as disorders or conditions myself, because as you'll see shortly, a lot of this stuff shows up simply from a slight misalignment of one of our brain's natural and generally helpful processes. It's like labeling being human as a condition. When conditions happen, I think of the mind-brain as more akin to a violin string that has gone slightly out of tune. In this situation, we don't label the instrument as defective and throw it away, but instead listen to what's wrong and tighten, or loosen, the strings a bit so that we can continue making music. Yet for diagnostic and billing purposes, anxiety disorders run the orchestral gamut from specific phobias, for example fear of spiders, to obsessive compulsive disorder, for example constantly worrying about germs and resultant constant hand washing, to generalized anxiety disorder, which is basically what it sounds like, excessive worry about everyday things. What flips the switch from everyday anxiety to disorder is somewhat in the eye of the diagnostician. For example, to meet a threshold for a diagnosis of GAD, someone must have excessive anxiety and worry about a variety of topics, events, or activities, and this must occur more often than not for at least 6 months and is clearly excessive. I love that last part, clearly excessive. Maybe I slept through the medical school lecture on how to determine exactly when worry moves from insufficiently to clearly excessive and signals that it's time to pull out my prescription pad or call in the meds. Because anxiety generally lives internally rather than manifesting itself as a big growth on the side of someone's head, I have to ask my patients a bunch of questions to see how their anxiety shows up. I certainly didn't know that I was anxious back in college until I put 2 and 2 together and finally connected my keeping track of all the bathrooms on my running route to worrying. Per the medical manuals, some of the typical symptoms of anxiety include edginess, restlessness, tiring easily, impaired concentration, irritability, increased muscle aches, and difficulty sleeping. But as you can clearly see, these symptoms by themselves don't pin a "this person is anxious" sign on your back for everyone to read. Critically, similar to my experience denying that I was anxious in college, I have to help my patients make the link between these manifestations and what's going on inside their head before we can move forward. To help highlight how differently anxiety can show up in a person's life, let me give you 2 examples from high-powered, put-together women. My wife, Mari, a 40-year-old college professor who's beloved by her students and internationally known for her research, can't remember when her anxiety came of age. It wasn't until she was in graduate school and had a conversation on this topic with her sister and cousin that she started recognizing family mannerisms as manifestations of anxiety. Putting a label on what seems quirky in isolation but is blazingly clear as a pattern was a light bulb moment for her. She put it this way: anxiety was so subtle that it wasn't until we could name it in our family that we could recognize it in ourselves. She noticed that her grandmother, her mother, and her aunt all had some level of anxiety, and that this had been the case for as long as she could remember. For example, when Mari was a kid, her mom would get caught up in excessive planning as a way to try to control her situations. This was especially evident when they were going on a trip. Mari hated getting ready for traveling because her mom's anxiety would show up in the form of snapping irritably at her, her father, and her sister.